The sun was dropping behind the red mesas when the stranger first appeared on the long road leading into Red Mesa Crossing. Evening wind dragged thin ribbons of dust across the crooked street, rattling hitching posts and sighing through the swinging doors of Harlan Pike's saloon. Most towns on the frontier quieted at sundown, but Red Mesa Crossing sharpened its attention instead. Men leaned against railings, gamblers paused mid-shuffle, and tired ranch hands lifted their eyes toward the road. They had learned long ago that anything arriving at dusk usually carried trouble in its shadow. Sheriff Gideon stood outside the jailhouse, thumbs hooked in his belt, gray mustache stirring in the wind. He watched the distant figure slowly take shape against the copper sky. At first, he thought it was another weary drifter. Then he noticed the uneven pace. The traveler stumbled once, steadied, and continued forward with stubborn determination. When the figure finally reached the edge of town, a hush rolled quietly along the street. She was young, far younger than anyone expected, and she carried the fragile exhaustion of someone who had walked too many miles alone. Dust dulled the color of her dress, yet nothing could hide the natural grace in the way she moved. Her dark hair clung loosely around a pale face, and her breathing sounded thin, like wind through dry grass. She stopped near the watering trough and gripped the wooden rim for balance. For a moment, nobody spoke. Finally, Harlan Pike stepped out from the saloon, wiping his hands on a stained cloth. His eyes traveled over the stranger with blunt suspicion. "Town's near empty of charity," he said. "Travelers usually bring coin if they expect kindness." The woman lifted her gaze. Weariness clouded her eyes, yet something steadier burned underneath. "I'm sick," she said quietly. "I can't walk much farther. Could I stay just one night?" Her voice carried across the street with fragile honesty. A murmur moved through the watching townsfolk. Some faces softened, others hardened. Red Mesa Crossing had survived too many tricks to trust sudden helplessness. Sheriff Gideon walked forward slowly. His boots scraped dust with deliberate patience. "Where you coming from, miss?" "South Trail," she answered. "My wagon train was attacked 3 days back. I've been walking since." The sheriff studied her carefully. Fear flickered behind her calm, but it did not look rehearsed. Still, trouble often wore convincing disguises. Before he could respond, a chair scraped softly from the shaded saloon porch. A tall man rose from the shadows. Conversation died instantly. The stranger had ridden into town earlier that afternoon, silent as drifting smoke. Few people had spoken with him. They only remembered the hard lines of his shoulders and the quiet weight he carried. Now he stepped into the fading light. His vest hung open, exposing a powerful chest marked with old scars. Dust clung to his boots and travel-worn trousers. He looked about 32, strong enough to split firewood all day without slowing. But the most striking thing about him was the stillness. He moved like someone who wasted nothing, not words, not motion, not attention. His eyes settled on the exhausted widow. He studied her for a long moment. Then he spoke. "She can stay in my cabin." The sentence dropped into the street like a stone into still water. Harlan Pike frowned. "You offering charity now?" The man ignored him. "I'll sleep in the barn," he added. Xylans stretched. The widow blinked with surprise. Sheriff Gideon's gaze sharpened. "You got a name, stranger." "Cole." The name meant little to most listeners. Yet something about the man's calm certainty unsettled them. Trouble usually bragged. This one barely breathed. Abigail Mercer straightened slowly. "Thank you," she whispered. Her strength seemed nearly spent, and without further argument Cole stepped beside her. He offered his arm. She hesitated before accepting. Together they began walking toward the far edge of town. Boots and soft footsteps echoed along the quiet street. Dozens of eyes followed them. Suspicion hung heavier than the evening heat. Sheriff Gideon watched until they passed the last hitching post. Something about the arrangement bothered him. The stranger had stepped forward too quickly. Kindness existed on the frontier, but rarely without reason. The cabin stood near the outskirts, a modest structure leaning beside a weathered cottonwood. Cole opened the door and guided Abigail inside. Lamplight soon warmed the dim room. She lowered herself into a wooden chair, breathing carefully. "You didn't have to do that," she said. Cole poured water from a tin kettle and handed her the cup. "Road gets cruel sometimes," he replied. She studied him across the lantern glow. "You don't seem like the charitable sort." A faint smile touched his mouth. "I'm not." Outside, night settled slowly over Red Mesa Crossing. Lamps flickered along the street, and distant coyotes began calling across the desert. Abigail sipped water with trembling hands. "They're still looking for me," she murmured. Cole's eyes lifted. "Who?" She hesitated. Fear crept visibly across her expression. Before she could answer, hoofbeats echoed faintly beyond the distant hills. Cole turned toward the dark window. Lantern light reflected quietly in his eyes. Far away, 5 riders moved along the ridge, silhouettes cutting across the moonlit horizon. They had stopped their horses and were watching the town. Watching the cabin. Cole said nothing for a long moment. The quiet between them thickened like gathering storm clouds. Abigail followed his gaze toward the window, though from her chair she could see only darkness. "What is it?" she asked softly. Cole stepped closer to the glass, careful not to silhouette himself against the light. "Visitors," he said. The words seemed to drain what little color remained in her face. "How many?" "Enough." Abigail closed her eyes briefly, as if some fear she had carried across miles had finally caught up with her. "They found me," she whispered. Cole turned back toward her. "Who are they?" She looked at the floor, weighing silence against truth. "Men who don't forgive witnesses." The answer hung cold in the room. Cole studied her more carefully now. Earlier he had seen only exhaustion. Now he noticed the tight discipline beneath it. Her posture straightened despite fatigue. Her eyes watched doors and windows with quiet awareness. This was not merely a wandering settler. "You want to explain that?" he asked. Abigail exhaled slowly. "My husband carried messages for the territorial courts." Cole remained still. "Important messages." She nodded. "Bandits stopped our wagon train because they thought he had something valuable." Her hands tightened around the tin cup. "He didn't survive the argument." The words were spoken without tears, yet the pain inside them was unmistakable. Cole leaned against the wall. "And you walked away from men like that." "I ran when the shooting started." She paused. "They think I took something." Cole's brow lifted slightly. "Did you?" Abigail met his gaze. For the first time since arriving, a flicker of stubborn defiance appeared. "Maybe." Outside, wind stirred dust across the empty street. Far away, the riders shifted position along the ridge. "They were patient." Predators often were. Cole pushed away from the wall. "You planning to tell the sheriff?" Abigail shook her head. "If I do, those men will burn this town to the ground, looking for what they lost." "And if you do?" She gave a faint, tired smile. "Then maybe they leave before sunrise." Cole glanced once more toward the hills. "Men like that don't leave empty-handed." Abigail looked toward the door. "You could still turn me out," she said. "Tell them where I am." Cole studied her quietly. "You asking me to?" "No." She straightened slightly. "Just reminding you the choice exists." The lantern flame flickered between them. Cole finally shrugged. "Too late now." Abigail frowned. "Why?" He nodded toward the window. "Because they already saw me bring you here." Understanding dawned slowly across her face. "So now they'll think you're involved." "Probably." "That was reckless." Cole allowed a small, humorless laugh. You should see some of my other decisions. For a brief moment, tension loosened. Then another distant hoofbeat carried faintly through the desert air. Abigail's fingers tightened again. They're moving. Cole listened. The rhythm of horses descending the ridge drifted slowly toward town. Yeah, he said quietly. They are. She looked at him. Why help me? Cole considered the question longer than expected. Because, he said eventually, sometimes the road sends people exactly where they're needed. Abigail studied his face, uncertain whether to believe him. Outside, lanterns glowed along the street as Red Mesa crossing settled uneasily into night. Sheriff Gideon still stood outside the jailhouse, watching the darkening hills. He could not yet see the riders, but instinct whispered that something had changed. Trouble was drifting closer. Back in the cabin, Abigail placed the empty cup aside. If those men come here, she said, they won't just take me. Cole rested one hand near the revolver hanging beside the door. I figured. They kill witnesses. I figured that too. Silence settled again. Abigail searched his expression. You don't seem worried. Cole gave a slow shrug. Worry doesn't change much. Outside, the hoofbeats grew clearer. Somewhere down the street, a dog began barking. Abigail rose unsteadily. I didn't mean to bring this to your door. Cole opened the cabin door slightly and looked toward town. Too late for regrets. Lantern light spilled into the dust. The approaching riders were still beyond the last hill, but their silhouettes were growing larger with every passing minute. Abigail stepped beside him. Do you think the sheriff will help? Cole watched the horizon. Sheriff helps his town. And me. Depends whether helping you saves it. The honesty in his voice surprised her. She wrapped her arms around herself against the cooling desert air. My husband believed people still did the right thing. Cole glanced sideways at her. Belief is stubborn. So was he. For a moment they stood together in the doorway, strangers bound suddenly by the same approaching danger. Wind rustled through the cottonwood branches beside the cabin. Farther down the street, Sheriff Gideon finally saw movement along the ridge. His hand drifted toward his revolver. Riders, he muttered. Back at the cabin, Abigail whispered, if they ask for me, don't fight them. Cole looked almost amused. You walked 3 days alone and still think you get to decide that. She met his eyes. I don't want anyone else dying because of me. Cole studied her carefully. Whatever she carried was clearly heavier than fear. Too late for that too, he said. The hoofbeats entered the edge of town. Horses snorted in the darkness. A distant voice called out sharply. Lamps flickered along the street as doors opened cautiously. Abigail's breath caught. They're here, she whispered. Cole closed the cabin door halfway, leaving only a narrow view toward town. Voices carried faintly through the night. One voice rose above the others, rough and confident. Abigail went pale. That's him. Who? The man leading them. Cole waited. Abigail swallowed hard. Ransom. Even saying the name seemed to darken the room. Cole's eyes narrowed slightly. You're certain? I heard the others call him that. Outside, a horse stamped loudly in the dirt. Then the same voice shouted across Red Mesa Crossing. We're looking for a woman traveling alone. Abigail closed her eyes. The outlaw's voice carried easily through the still night. Young widow, he continued, walked into town before sundown. Cole glanced toward Abigail. She did not move. Outside, boots scraped the dusty street as riders spread slowly through town. The voice rang out again. Send her out, the outlaw called, and nobody else gets hurt. Cole rested his hand calmly on the revolver grip. Abigail opened her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Cole looked back toward the lantern light glowing behind them. Then he said quietly, "Reckon that one night just turned into something longer." Outside, the outlaws cocked their rifles. The rifles outside clicked into readiness, a sharp metallic chorus that sliced through the stillness of the desert night. Cole did not rush. He eased the cabin door closed with careful fingers and slid the iron latch into place. The small sound felt heavier than thunder. Abigail Mercer stood in the middle of the room, her breathing shallow and uneven, as if every breath required permission. "They'll burn the place," she whispered. Cole turned the lantern wick lower until the room softened into shadow. "Maybe," he said. The calmness in his voice unsettled her more than panic would have. Outside, hooves scraped slowly across dirt. The riders were spreading through the town like wolves circling a campfire. A voice rose again from the street, rough and confident. "Last chance, people, we know she's here." The sound carried straight through the thin cabin walls. Abigail's hands trembled. "You should let me go," she said. Cole leaned against the wall beside the door. "You keep saying that." "Because it's true." "If I believed that," he replied quietly, "you wouldn't be standing in my cabin." She opened her mouth to argue, but the words never came. Instead, she stared at him, searching his face as if trying to measure something she did not yet understand. From outside came the creak of saddle leather and the uneasy murmur of townsfolk gathering in the street. Sheriff Gideon's voice soon followed, firm and controlled. "You men state your business proper." Boots shuffled across the dirt. Then the rough voice answered, "We're hunting a thief." Abigail closed her eyes. Cole listened carefully, absorbing every tone and pause. "What kind of thief?" the sheriff asked. "The kind that stole something that doesn't belong to her." "And you figure she wandered into my town?" "We know she did." The quiet confidence in the outlaw's voice told Cole more than any threat. These men were not guessing. They were certain. Abigail pressed a hand against the wooden table to steady herself. "They won't leave," she murmured. Cole watched the door. "Probably not. You still have time to tell them where I am." He glanced over his shoulder. "You planning to walk out there? If it stops bloodshed." Cole studied her a moment longer. "You talk brave for someone who just walked 3 days through the desert." Her mouth twitched faintly. "Bravery doesn't mean I'm not afraid." "Good," he said. "Fear keeps people alive." Outside, Sheriff Gideon spoke again. "You bring proof of this theft." The outlaw laughed. "You think we ride around with paperwork?" "I think," Gideon replied coldly, "that you're making noise in my town." Silence followed. Then the outlaw's tone hardened. "Listen close, lawman. The woman took something valuable from us. Hand her over and we ride away." "And if I refuse?" A pause stretched long enough for the wind to whisper through empty streets. "Then we start searching." Inside the cabin, Abigail sank slowly into the chair. "They'll tear the town apart." Cole crouched beside the lantern and adjusted the wick slightly. "Maybe. You say that word a lot. It fits most situations." She studied him again. "You don't sound like a drifter." He shrugged. "People rarely sound like what they are." Her eyes lingered on the faint scars across his chest. "You've been in fights." "Few. Gunfights." Cole did not answer. Outside, Boots approached the far end of the street. The riders had begun spreading from building to building. One of them shouted toward the saloon. Another kicked open the stable doors. Abigail flinched at the noise. "They're getting closer." Cole walked to the small window and lifted the curtain edge with 2 fingers. Lanterns flickered in the distance. Sheriff Gideon stood near the center of the street, his broad shape planted like a stubborn fence post between the outlaws and the rest of town. Two deputies hovered nervously behind him. "You trust that sheriff?" Cole asked. Abigail hesitated. "I don't know him." That wasn't the question. She watched the faint glow of lanterns through the window. "He sounds like a man trying to do the right thing." Cole lowered the curtain again. "Then he's probably in trouble." Another voice outside called out sharply, "Check the houses." Abigail's shoulders tightened. "They'll come here." Cole nodded. "Eventually." Her gaze dropped to the worn leather satchel resting beside the chair. For several seconds she stared at it as if the object carried the weight of a storm. Cole noticed. "That what they're after?" Abigail did not look up. "Yes." "What's inside?" "Proof." "Of what?" She swallowed slowly. "That the men outside don't just rob wagon trains." Cole waited. "They control half the outlaw gangs across the territory," she continued. "Bribes, smuggling routes, stolen cattle, stolen land." Her voice trembled with suppressed anger. "My husband carried documents exposing everything." Cole's expression remained unreadable. "And you took them." "They killed him," she said. The sentence hung between them like a gunshot echo. "I wasn't letting his work disappear with him." Cole crossed the room slowly and lifted the satchel. It felt heavier than paper should. "You planning to deliver these somewhere?" "Yes." "Where?" "To the federal marshal in Carson Territory." Cole raised an eyebrow. "That's a long ride." "I know." "You planning to ride it alone?" "If I have to." Outside, a horse trotted closer along the road. Hoofbeats stopped just beyond the cabin. Both of them froze. A rider's shadow passed across the window. Someone tested the latch of the neighboring shed. The wood creaked loudly. Abigail's breathing quickened. Cole gently placed the satchel back on the table. "You any good with a gun?" he asked quietly. She shook her head. "I hoped not to need one." "Hope's a thin strategy." "Do you have a better one?" Cole listened to the rider outside for several seconds. The man eventually spat into the dirt and rode back toward the others. Only then did Cole relax slightly. "Better strategy is patience," he said. "For what?" "For them to make mistakes." She gave a faint, tired laugh. "You sound like someone who's done this before." "Maybe." "Who are you, really?" Cole leaned against the wall again. "Just a man passing through. People like you don't simply pass through." He did not respond. Outside, the outlaw leader spoke again. "Search the cabins." Sheriff Gideon's voice cut through immediately. "You take one step toward those homes and we'll have a problem." The outlaw chuckled. "I think we already do." Abigail's hands tightened on the chair. "They'll start shooting." Cole tilted his head slightly, listening. "No," he said after a moment. "Not yet." "Why?" "Because they still think they can scare the town into giving you up." She looked at him carefully. "And if they realize they—" Cole's gaze drifted back to the revolver hanging near the door. "Then things get louder." Another long silence filled the cabin. The lantern flame swayed gently. Abigail finally spoke again. "My husband believed the law could clean this territory." Cole glanced toward the door. "Law only as strong as the people holding it. That's why those papers matter." She rested one hand on the satchel. "If they reach the right hands, the men outside lose everything." Cole watched her thoughtfully. "You walked 3 days through the desert protecting that." "Yes." "Why not hide it somewhere?" "Because hiding doesn't stop evil." Cole almost smiled. "You sound like your husband." "He said that too." Outside, the riders regrouped near the center of town. One of them shouted something that made the others laugh. The sound carried across the night with cruel ease. Abigail's jaw tightened. They killed him for doing the right thing. Cole looked toward the window again. Men like that usually do. Doesn't it ever make you angry? Anger's expensive, he replied. Costs more than it gives back. She studied him in silence. You speak like a man who's buried people. Cole's expression darkened slightly. Everybody on the frontier buries someone. The distant laughter outside faded. Then the outlaw leader called out once more. Lawmans. Sheriff Gideon answered. What? You hiding her somewhere. You got no authority to search my town. Maybe not. The outlaw's voice sharpened with amusement. But I got patience. The wind lifted dust along the street. Lantern light flickered across tense faces. Inside the cabin, Abigail whispered, they'll stay until morning. Cole nodded. Looks that way. And then he turned toward her. Morning changes things. How? People get braver in daylight. She considered that. Or more desperate. That too. Outside, footsteps approached again. This time they stopped directly outside the cabin. A knuckle rapped sharply against the door. Abigail stiffened. Neither of them moved. Another knock came, louder. Then a familiar voice spoke through the wood. Cole. It was Sheriff Gideon. Cole opened the door slightly. The sheriff stood alone on the porch, hat pulled low. His sharp eyes swept the cabin interior. So it's true, Gideon said quietly. Cole nodded once. The sheriff stepped inside and shut the door behind him. You realize what kind of trouble this brings to my town. Cole folded his arms. I got a rough idea. Gideon turned toward Abigail. Ma'am, those men out there say you stole something valuable. I did, she answered calmly. The sheriff raised his eyebrows. That's honest. It wasn't theirs to begin with. Mind explaining? Abigail pushed the satchel forward. Documents proving those men run a criminal network across the territory. Gideon opened the bag carefully. Lantern light reflected across stacks of folded papers sealed with official markings. The sheriff's expression hardened as he skimmed one page. Good Lord, he murmured. Cole watched him. Real. Looks real. The sheriff closed the satchel slowly. You realize what this means? Abigail nodded. It means those men can never let me leave. Gideon exhaled heavily. And it means if they think this town is protecting you. He didn't finish the sentence. The implication hung heavy in the room. Cole looked toward the window again. How many riders? He asked. 5, Gideon replied. More might come by morning. The sheriff studied Cole carefully. You any good with that revolver? Cole shrugged. Good enough. Gideon sighed. I had a feeling. Abigail looked between them. What happens now? The sheriff rested both hands on the table. Now, he said slowly, we decide whether Red Mesa Crossing is brave enough to stand against men like Ransom. Cole's eyes flickered slightly at the name. You know him? Gideon asked. Heard stories. Most of them true. The sheriff walked to the door and glanced outside. The riders waited in the street, dark shapes circling lantern light. He turned back to the room. They won't leave, he said. Cole nodded. Figured. Gideon looked from Cole to Abigail. Then I guess we better prepare. Abigail's voice was barely audible. For what? Cole answered before the sheriff could. For the moment they stopped asking politely. Outside, Ransom's voice rang out again across the silent town. "This is your final warning." The words echoed through the desert air. Inside the cabin, Cole slowly lifted the revolver from its hook. The sheriff checked the cylinder of his own weapon. Abigail gripped the satchel that had already cost one life. And in the stillness before the storm, Sheriff Gideon looked at Cole with sudden realization and said quietly, "Strange thing is, I think I've seen the way you handle a gun before." Sheriff Gideon studied Cole as though a half-forgotten memory had just stepped out of the desert. The lantern flickered between them, casting long wavering shadows across the cabin walls. Outside, the town held its breath while 5 armed riders waited in the dusty street. "You ever serve the law?" Gideon asked quietly. Cole rotated the cylinder of his revolver and snapped it closed. "Once," he said. "That explains the calm." Cole slid extra cartridges across the table toward the sheriff. "Explains the trouble, too." Abigail Mercer watched the 2 men with tense silence. The satchel of documents rested against her knees, heavier than any weapon in the room. Gideon tucked the cartridges into his belt. "You know the man out there's." "Ransom," Cole said. "Yeah, I've heard stories. Most of them ugly." Cole looked toward the door. Ugly men tend to make long stories. Outside's voice rang again across the town. "Time up." The sound shattered the fragile stillness. Gideon blew out a slow breath. "Guess talking over." He opened the door a few inches and glanced into the street. Lantern light burned against drifting dust. The 5 riders had spread out in a loose half-circle, rifles balanced across their saddles. Sat at the center of them, broad-shouldered and relaxed, as if the town already belonged to him. Gideon closed the door again. "They're ready." Cole nodded once. "You got deputies nearby." 2 nervous boys, but they'll stand if I ask." Cole considered the room quickly. "We keep the fight outside. Last thing this town needs is bullets through its homes." Gideon gave a grim smile. "You planning the battle already?" "Just thinking ahead." Abigail rose slowly from the chair. "No," she said. Both men turned toward her. "This shouldn't become a war," she continued. "I'll go out there's." Cole's expression hardened. "You step outside with that satchel, and none of us see sunrise. They only want the papers." His laughter drifted faintly through the walls, as if the outlaw could hear their conversation. Cole shook his head. "They want control. Papers just prove they lost it." Abigail held his gaze. "I won't let more people die because of me." Cole stepped closer. "You're not the cause of this." "Then what is?" "Men like." Gideon pushed his hat down firmly. "Miss Mercer," he said gently, "if you walk out there, they'll take the papers and kill you anyway." The truth landed heavy in the room. Abigail's shoulders sagged slightly. "So what do we do?" Cole holstered his revolver and opened the cabin door wide. "We make them regret coming here." The cold desert air rushed inside. Gideon followed him onto the porch. The sheriff's boots hit the ground first, his silhouette solid beneath the lantern glow. Cole stepped down beside him. Across the street, smile widened. "Well now," the outlaw called, "looks like the law decided to talk." Gideon's voice cut cleanly through the night. "You got no claim here, ride out while you still can." Chuckled. "You know why I like small towns, Sheriff?" "No." "Because they always think they're braver than they are." The other riders laughed softly. Cole stood slightly behind Gideon, studying the arrangement of horses, rifles, and shadows. Every movement felt slow and deliberate, as though time itself had grown cautious. His eyes finally settled on Cole. "And who's this?" he asked. "Just a man offering a room," Gideon replied. Tilted his head. "You must be mighty generous." Cole met his gaze without speaking. Studied him longer. Then something flickered in the outlaw's expression. "Well now," he murmured. "That face looks familiar." Cole's voice was calm. "Can't say the same." Leaned forward in the saddle. "You ever ride with the marshals, friend?" The street grew quieter. Cole didn't answer immediately. Snapped his fingers. "That's it," he said. "Cole." A ripple of surprise moved through the watching townsfolk. "I heard you were dead," continued. Cole shrugged. "Rumors travel faster than truth." His grin sharpened. "So the ghost finally shows himself." Gideon glanced sideways at Cole. "You didn't mention that part. Didn't seem important." Laughed loudly. "Oh, it's important." His voice hardened. "This man's been hunting my business for 3 years." The outlaw leaned forward in the saddle. "And now he's hiding behind a town." Cole stepped out from Gideon's shadow. "Not hiding." "Then what?" "Waiting." Studied him carefully. "For what?" Cole's hand rested loosely near his revolver. "For you to make the first mistake." Silence stretched across Red Mesa Crossing. Wind whispered along the street. Men shifted uneasily in their saddles. The outlaw's grin faded slightly. "You think 5 guns scare me," Cole continued. His hand drifted toward his rifle. "You always were arrogant. And you always talked too much." The next moment exploded like lightning. His rifle snapped upward. Cole's revolver cleared leather in a single fluid motion. The first shot cracked through the night. One outlaw tumbled backward from his horse before he even realized the fight had begun. Gunfire erupted across the street. Gideon fired from behind a water trough, his steady aim dropping another rider. Deputies rushed from the saloon porch, rifles shaking but determined. Horses screamed and scattered as bullets tore through the lantern light. Cole moved with terrifying calm. Each shot was precise, controlled, final. Another rider slumped sideways across his saddle. Dove behind a hitching post, firing wildly. Dust leapt from the ground around Cole's boots. Gideon shouted orders across the chaos. "Hold the street." The remaining outlaws scrambled for cover. Within seconds, the town had become a storm of gunfire and echoing thunder. Inside the cabin, Abigail clutched the satchel as the battle roared outside. Every shot tightened the knot in her chest. She forced herself toward the window. Through the narrow gap, she saw Cole moving through drifting smoke, calm as stone, while bullets tore past him. He fought not with rage, but with grim purpose. Another outlaw charged from the stable with a rifle raised. Cole fired once. The man collapsed before reaching the street. Only remained. The outlaw staggered from behind the hitching post, revolver in hand. Dust coated his coat and fury burned in his eyes. "Enough," he shouted. The gunfire stopped. Cole stood 20 feet away, revolver steady. Spat into the dirt. "You think you've won." Cole said nothing. His eyes flicked toward the cabin where Abigail waited. "This town dies the moment I'm gone." "Maybe," Cole replied. "But you won't see it." His grin returned slowly. "You always liked dramatic endings. Just honest ones." They faced each other beneath the fading lantern light. The entire town seemed to fade into silence around them. Gideon lowered his rifle but stayed ready. No one dared breathe. Rolled his shoulders once. "You remember the old rule." Cole's voice was steady. "Fastest hand wins." Nodded. "Always did." The two men stood motionless. Wind pushed dust between them like drifting ghosts. Then's hand twitched. 2 shots cracked almost together. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then's revolver slipped from his fingers. The outlaw dropped to his knees. Cole lowered his gun slowly, stared at the dark stains spreading across his chest. "You never miss," he rasped. Cole holstered the weapon. "Not when it matters." Collapsed into the dust. The street fell silent except for the nervous breathing of men who had just survived something terrible. Gideon walked forward slowly. "You just ended a nightmare," he said. Cole looked toward the cabin. "Not yet." Abigail stepped outside, the satchel still clutched tightly. The townspeople watched her with a mixture of awe and relief. Gideon took the documents carefully. "These will bring down half the criminals in the territory." Abigail nodded. "My husband believed that." Cole studied the horizon, where the first hint of dawn had begun to glow. The long night was finally breaking. Gideon extended his hand. "You could stay here," the sheriff said. "Town like this could use a man with your aim." Cole shook the offered hand but stepped back. "My work's not finished." Abigail approached him quietly. "Where wills you go?" Cole looked toward the endless desert. "Wherever men like still think they own the road." She smiled faintly, though sadness touched her eyes. "You saved my life." Cole shook his head. "You carried the truth across the desert." He glanced at the papers in Gideon's hands. "That's what saved everyone." Morning light spread slowly across Red Mesa Crossing. The long night of fear had ended. Cole mounted his horse as the town watched in quiet respect. Abigail stood beside the sheriff, the wind lifting strands of her dark hair. Cole tipped his hat once. Then he turned toward the open horizon. As his horse carried him beyond the edge of town, Abigail realized something that left her heart strangely full. The quiet stranger who had given her one night of shelter had changed the fate of an entire territory. And somewhere out on the endless road ahead, another town was waiting for the moment when a man named Cole would ride in just before sunset.